Okay, today I'm delighted to be joined by Brendan May, who's the founder and chairman at Robertsbridge and a board member of the Metals Company. His CV is as long as your arm, with stints at the Marine Stewardship Council and the Rainforest Alliance, amongst many others. But we will dig into that. But for now, welcome to the podcast, Brendan.
Thanks, Gareth. Nice to see you.
So, as I say, you seem to have a very large and wide background, sort of career so far. But when did you first get started in sustainability?
It was in 1998. I was working as a political researcher in the House of Commons, and I met John Gummer, now Lord Deben.
Yeah.
Lord Deben had just become the chair of the Marine Stewardship Council. So the Conservatives had just lost the 97 election, and John had become chairman of the MSC at the invitation of Unilever and WWF. And I wasn't really into party politics at all. And I told him this, and he said, if you like politics, but you don't like party politics, you should go into the environment. The environment is the most interesting political issue of our age. And bear in mind, back then, it wasn't quite the political issue that it is now. So he said, will you go and work at the Marine Stewardship Council and be in charge of our communications and external affairs? So I agreed to do that. Mm-hmm. Knew nothing about fisheries, nothing about sustainability particularly, but I found it very interesting. And it was one of the first green business partnerships, a multi-stakeholder organisation, which in those days there weren't that many of. You had the FSC already, but the MSC was modelled to some extent on that. And then within about a year and a half, I ended up running that organisation. So I ran it for 5 years, and that's what gave me my kind of start in the sustainable business world.
Yes, I noticed when on LinkedIn, when that year as a special advisor, you say you swore you'd never go back. Was it that bad?
And I haven't.
So then, how did your career progress?
So the MSC the MSC was obviously a great induction into the world of NGOs, of retailers, of food companies, enraged NGOs, pragmatic, business-friendly NGOs. It was very global. The seafood was coming from the US, from Australia, New Zealand. So it's a massive immersion in the whole world of sustainability and of certification and eco-labeling and all the politics around that. And then when I left there, I went to a communications firm called Weber Shandwick and set up their first ever sustainability practice. And it was a little bit unusual because Weber Shandwick's a big communications agency. It's a public relations firm. Mm-hmm. But my bit of it wasn't doing that. It was doing what we would now call sustainability consultancy. And this was 20 years ago, actually, this year. So it was a little bit unusual back then. And at the same time, I joined the board of the Rainforest Alliance because I knew about certification. And that was all very interesting because Rainforest Alliance was emerging as an alternative to fair trade for certification of coffee, in particular, in this country, and also cocoa and bananas. So I was very involved in the sustainable agriculture and deforestation world at the same time. So I did that for about 5 years. And then I set up Robertsbridge, where I've been ever since, now for 15 years, incredibly.
And so what do you do? What takes up most of your time at Robertsbridge?
Robertsbridge is involved in some of the big debates of our time. We act as a bridge between NGO campaigners and companies. We do a lot of work in Southeast Asia on tropical commodities and deforestation, so palm oil, pulp and paper. We work for very large companies in Indonesia, in Malaysia, out of Singapore. We now have an office in Jakarta with 7 people in it. We have an office in Singapore. The other part of our work is sustainability strategies and plans and net zero plans. So we did OVO Energy's Plan Zero back in 2017, I think it was. We did Heathrow Airport's sustainability plan at around the same time. We did Primark's sustainability plan. So big, kind of bold plans with goals and targets. Mm-hmm. And really, a lot of what we do is helping companies navigate this space, the sustainable business landscape, with all of its reporting and disclosure requirements, all of its NGO politics, all of its commercial and shareholder interests. So you'll often find Robertsbridge in the middle of these quite topical discussions.
And across your career so far, what are you most proud of, modesty aside?
I love the work that we have done. I love the fact that we are behind some of the kind of more reputable sustainability plans. So OVO's plan, that was the first, I think it was the first net zero plan that anyone produced. It was right at the end of the Theresa May premiership. So net zero had just kind of gone into law. And OVO, I think, launched it, a month or two later. So I'm proud of some of those plans. The Primark plan, I think we've done some really good work on those. And also I'm proud of some of the mediations we've done between companies and NGOs. So there's a Malaysian palm oil company called IOI, which about 6 years ago was on the end of a very, very tough Greenpeace campaign. Mm-hmm. So IOI's customers were delisting it as a supplier, and we went in and mediated between Greenpeace and IOI, and that ended really well, and everybody made friends, and both sides moved and shifted, and we reached a good compromise. And I'm quite proud of that one, because it was these things can go either way. Some of the mediations work and some do not, and it's all down to how much each side is willing to compromise at the end of the day.
Yeah, I have a particular interest in palm oil because my youngest child refuses to eat anything with palm oil in it that's not certified sustainable, which means he eats very little because it's in everything. But compared to cocoa, for example, where you do get sort of rainforest alliance type or coffee, where you get these badges, palm oil, for all the round tables and whatnot, we don't see a lot of sustainability badges on supermarket products.
No, you'll find reference to the RSPO on some products, but yeah, it's very hard to go and seek out. And as you say, because it's in everything pretty much, cosmetics and toothpaste and confectionery and many, many other foods besides, it's not easy to identify in the way that you could choose an MSC certified seafood product, or FSC certified charcoal or loo roll or whatever it is you're buying that's pulp based. But the good news about palm oil, and a lot of my kids too have been taught that palm oil is a bad thing, so they are. I think it's often used in schools as an example of deforestation and orangutans, but unfortunately, the education system hasn't quite caught up with the fact that actually palm oil is one of the best sector stories of transformation on the planet. It's not perfect, but the work that's been done by all of the big palm oil players in the last decade, because of very effective campaigning by groups like Greenpeace and Mighty Earth and others, it is a bit of a success story, and you can see the rate of deforestation in somewhere like Indonesia for palm oil has leveled off quite dramatically. So I'm not a fan of some of these campaigns that palm oil free, don't touch anything with palm oil in it, because as ever in our world of sustainability, the unintended consequences of other comparable oils may be very much worse from a land use perspective. You're
right. As well, it's something I will have to dig in again, if only to make my supermarket shopping more simple. It is extremely difficult. You mentioned Theresa May, ex-UK Prime Minister, and are bringing net zero into law for the first time. How do you feel the political situation in the UK? Obviously, we've just had a change of government in the general election about 10 weeks ago. But where do you think we are in terms of business and sustainability and politics? Just to throw that into the mix, we seem to go from Theresa May's pushing the net zero, and then Boris Johnson, brought in the various policies to try and get some of the way there anyway on heat pumps and electric vehicles, and then subsequent prime ministers have rode back on it, and then obviously we've had now a flip to a Labour government. So where do you see that landscape at the minute?
Well, it's very interesting, isn't it? I mean, I think whatever your politics, anyone would acknowledge that politics in the UK in the last 6 or 7 years has been a car crash. I mean, it's just been, I forget how many different ministers there've been for all the portfolios, but something like 10 education ministers, 12 health ministers. I mean, it's not really been a governable country. That seems to have changed now. And again, regardless of your politics, I think everyone would acknowledge we're probably in a period of some more stability. And the new government appears to have quite a zeal for getting on with things in relation to the acceleration of net zero. I think the worry I have about politics, regardless of who is in power, is this underbelly of culture war populism, which exists whether the Conservatives are in power or Labour are in power, and it's the same in the United States, whether Donald Trump is in power or Joe Biden or maybe Kamala Harris is in power. There's this enormous culture war going on where everything, including climate action, is now labelled as woke. And I'm quite concerned that climate, which is at the end of the day a scientific reality, is being lumped in with a bunch of other issues, whether it's Black Lives Matter, transgender issues, veganism, all the things these culture wars go on about, how we teach colonial history. Oh, and climate change, that's woke. This ridiculous argument going on about the National Trust and its vegan scones. And I mean, we can't really afford for the agenda to be lumped into that bucket because it transcends all of that. This is not a culture war issue. Now, there are big issues about how one should tackle the climate emergency and how taxpayer subsidies should be used for particular types of vehicles or incentives or the carrot and stick approach. But I think that is a challenge no matter who is in power, because if you don't carry those people with you, you give rise to sort of Farageist, Trumpist dismissal of the agenda. And that has a constituency of people that go, yeah, you see, it's just like that issue. It's politically correct. And they start to deny that this is a climate emergency. And that limits the space for politicians to act if they feel that it's going to harm their prospects electorally. So this to me is much more important than nuances about, whether Boris Johnson, stuck with his 10-point plan or whether Liz Truss, is a sort of grifting, paid up member of US front groups, which I feel probably is. But, we've got to accept the fact that there are large numbers of people who are very cynical about this. And of course, then when they see motorways being blocked or, they see some of the protests that go on, that fuels that division in society. And we can't really afford for that to happen on the climate debate.
Yeah. Well, what strikes me is, it's easy to say, okay, here's a net zero target. Let's put it into law, and everybody goes clap, clap, clap. And then you say, right, okay, how are we going to phase out internal combustion engine cars? Or to take I suppose a more current example is the change in the steel industry from blast furnaces to electric arc furnaces, which is going to lead to a net loss of jobs.
Yep.
And people are saying, well, what about all these green jobs? So I suppose there's all that transition difficulty we're going to have.
These are very difficult trade-offs. We had the same with Scotland and oil, and when we were going to have a freeze on all new licenses, the trade unions in Scotland rose up very quickly. And it's not; these aren't really left-right issues. It's much more complicated than that. And I think as well, the governments historically have not been very good at implementing these initiatives. I mean, look at the mess over HS2. I mean, how many billions have been wasted on that? I mean, government is not famed for being an efficient delivery vehicle for these initiatives, and the constant chopping and changing. And of course, businesses can't really plan capital expenditure against that background of uncertainty and ever-changing regulations around feed-in tariffs and onshore wind and so on. It's a very, very difficult landscape to navigate. My hope is, now that we have a new government with a big majority and someone like Ed Miliband, who clearly knows his onions on this stuff,
Mm-hmm.
that we will have a period of sustained acceleration of this agenda.
Yeah. I sometimes think some of the more effective things have been lower profile. The carbon floor price basically killed off the UK coal-fired power sector, and we didn't get a complaint. We didn't get there was no unions rising up about that or anything else. And yet the steel making thing seems to become a little bit more totemic in terms of newspaper headlines. And so my personal view is we're going to have some interesting arguments ahead, but we'd need to start showing some of the benefits, because people will always pounce on the downsides.
Pylons is another one. We need hundreds of new kilometers of pylons, and guess what? Nobody wants them. But they're critical to the delivery of green infrastructure. So, we've got, again, it's all about trade-offs and choices. This is all we deal with at Robertsbridge, is these trade-offs. Deep sea metals, hugely controversial issue, but it's not one we can't hide from it, because there are other ways of getting metals that may not be as good.
Well, should we dive into that a little bit? Because I did pick that up.
You can dive into
it. Oh yes, the pun wasn't intended, but I should pretend it was slickly thrown in there. But yes, perhaps you could explain that metals issue in more detail for us.
So what is generally called deep sea mining, which is unfortunate because there are different forms of it. And actually, the thing I'm involved in is the collection of polymetallic nodules, which look like black rock potatoes, which sit on the seafloor, on the abyssal plains, in this case, in the Clarion-Clipperton zone of the Pacific Ocean between Hawaii and Mexico. So it's a very specific, very, very large area. And abyssal plains, most of the planet, by the way, there are more abyssal plains on the planet than any other form of geology. So most of the planet is abyssal plain. And you might think of it, I am not a marine biologist, so I don't want to simplify this, but you could think of it as the ocean version of the desert. Broadly, it's very deep. So we're talking depths of 4,000 meters plus, and we have these polymetallic nodules, and they sit there. They take a long time to form, but they are very rich in nickel, copper, manganese, and cobalt, which of course are the metals that we need for the decarbonisation transition. At the moment, business as usual is that we derive those nickels from terrestrial mining, often in very, very sensitive ecosystems in Indonesia, Africa, and other tropical areas. Now, the proposal that we should start collecting these nodules has been met by a lot of concern, in some cases hysteria, but it is a controversial, it's probably it is, I think, the most controversial trade-off debate of the decade. It's not that new a debate, but it's now that it's all coming to the fore, because the International Seabed Authority, which is the sort of regulator of this zone, is putting in place a mining code, a series of regulations to regulate this industry should it begin. And the arguments against it are that, this is the last pristine frontier that we've never touched, we must leave it alone, and then various concerns about, disturbance of those ecosystems and what those impacts might be on other marine life, versus arguments for it that no people or communities live down there, that need to be displaced, as is often the case with terrestrial mining, that the biodiversity down there, which nobody says there is none, but is infinitesimally small in terms of grams per square meter compared with a square meter of Indonesian rainforest, and that the economies of scale of having 4 metals in one rock will ultimately mean that we can do the massive increase in metal production that we need with a lighter planetary touch than we are currently on track for. And there's a lot of science coming out every week about this, which is required to be done. There are disagreements between some scientists on how good or bad this might be. I started working on it last year as Robertsbridge, and then about a year into that, I was asked to join the board, and I willingly agreed because I think it's one of the most potentially game-changing interventions if it is done well and properly, which we believe it can be. And I think all companies should have sustainability represented on their boards, and it's the first listed company board I've joined, and I'm really enjoying it.
Yeah, I'm just seeing a parallel there with what you're saying about pylons or palm oil, is that sometimes we accept bad stuff because it's always been like that. But you produce an alternative that might be better, and people concentrate on the downsides.
Yeah, and we've been here before with the unintended consequences of not doing things. Mm-hmm. So nuclear power, which I know some people are still very against, and more for economic reasons than anything else, I think now. But had we done nuclear power in the right way across Europe, for example, countries like Germany, years ago, we would have a zero carbon source of power, right? So, and we didn't do it. So look at Germany; it's still trying to get out of, extremely high emitting technologies. And then something like the Ukraine invasion happens, and again focuses everybody's mind. GMOs, were painted as bad, full stop. Well, it's much more complicated than that. There are GMOs which are not bad and which are actually fairly vital to food security in places where people will otherwise go hungry. Carbon offsetting, starts as the great panacea, then gets called a sort of crime against humanity, and REDD+ gets virtually dismantled by tax, which then affects the flow of capital finance into forests. And we know that if the finance doesn't flow to the forest, we know what will happen to the forest. It won't exist. None of these things are easy.
Yeah.
That's the truth of it. Deep sea metals, it's not an easy topic. I had a big event about it yesterday, and it was a fascinating and rich conversation with scientists, with NGOs, with the company, and it was a fantastic conversation because it's a very nuanced issue, and we didn't all leave agreeing on everything. Yeah. But this is where the magic happens in these dialogues and in these discussions. We can't pretend that there's a black and white yes or no answer to everything. There simply isn't.
Yes. The last couple of guests I've had on the podcast have been funding their various projects through voluntary carbon credits, stroke offsetting. And I think you touched on it there. It seems to be the bit of the equation that people don't focus on. They look at company X and they say, oh, they're just buying off, their carbon footprint. And it's like, well, no, it's my personal view is you should look at it like a voluntary carbon tax that's ring fenced for green projects. And, Claudine Blamey of Aviva was talking about their temperate rainforest revival project, which is kind of an offsetting. I think they're building it into an offsetting project rather than it being explicitly offsetting. But whether or not that project actually captures carbon, it's improving the biodiversity of the areas affected. So offsetting, I think, is one that, a bit like some of those other topics, we really are going to have to bite the bullet on. Now, obviously, there have been failures in some of the projects that have been going on, but
one bad project does not an entire industry condemn, right?
Yes.
And I agree with you. I mean, the thing is that a lot of these projects need to be happening anyway, because they are doing exactly that. They're not just preserving the biodiversity, they're preserving livelihoods of the people who live in these places. The big question for me always is what should a company be allowed to claim against that investment? This is the problem. I mean, clearly, if you say your Lufthansa flight is carbon neutral, that's a problem. I can understand why there's a lot of regulation coming in on green, because it's somewhat misleading. But on the other hand, if you don't allow companies to claim anything, and I think some sort of the word compensation is probably better than offset, but there's got that we need to probably find a new terminology instead of going, no, all of that's rubbish, it shouldn't happen. And we've seen the consequences of that. There's a project in Cambodia, and an NGO, always, by the way, a Western NGO, flew in, found the people that weren't happy, and you will always find one community that's not happy or that's been left out of the consultation or alienated from it in some way. Oh, this is all terrible, human rights abuses, terrible project, doesn't save any carbon, by the way. So if you're Deliveroo or Uber or Google or somebody who's thinking of investing in that project because you want to make a claim, that's you out of the picture. So the money doesn't come. The project couldn't sell any verified emissions reductions for a year. Who's harmed? The communities that live there. And if you go on LinkedIn, you will find a video of a community leader in that Cambodian area just in despair about the impact that had on not just the biodiversity projects, the conservation projects, but on the people. And having worked very extensively in Southeast Asia in the last 11 years, I have a real problem with what I regard as a neo-colonial attitude of some, not all, of some NGOs who go and sort of stir the pot and then leave, and then no regard for the consequences of what they have stirred up.
Yes.
None of them are doing solutions. They are only doing problems, and we don't have time for this nonsense.
So I suppose if we move on to NGOs in general and campaigning is, what do you think NGO, you mentioned before, good pragmatic NGOs, what do you feel sets apart? You might have to repeat some of what you've said because you've gone into this in a certain extent. Sets apart the effective NGOs and the ineffective ones or the destructive ones.
I think the effective. So there's obviously different types of NGOs. There are NGOs who aren't really there to attack business. They are working in the field, doing conservation, doing audits. And then they are, if you like, quite technical, and they work with business and they produce their work, and it's all good stuff. There are great scientific focused NGO, WRI, it's a very respected, well-run organization, I think. Then you have the certification systems, which are a bit everybody's roadkill, everyone hates them. Bars too high, bars too low, but they do their job of assuring on the commodity that they're there to certify. And then you have, the campaigning NGOs. Now, the campaigning NGOs, some just rattle the cage and walk away, and they are poorly suited to being involved in the solutions. Others are very smart and strategic, and they will produce very, very hard-hitting reports, but they will also engage with companies and try to reform them and then praise them for doing so. So I would put Mighty Earth in that category. I think Mighty Earth is a very effective, it's not very big, by the way, but it's a very effective campaigning NGO. I think one of the problems for the NGO movement in the last decade, and particularly the last 5 or 6 years, is the growth of what I call them flash mob activist groups like Just Stop Oil, Extinction Rebellion, Climate Strike. I think because they've been very, very, very effective. There is no question about that, whether you agree with their tactics or not. I think they've left some of the more traditional campaigning groups in a bit of a quandary about what their mission is. And so there's this struggle. But are we about solutions? Are we about problems? Should we be engaging business, not engaging business? And I think as well that these more recent groups have become much better at kind of grabbing the public's attention. Yeah. And I don't like pouring soup over works of art, and I actually think it's clinically stupid to block motorways because I think it feeds that populism. Yeah. So against, if you want to alienate exactly the floating voters that Farage is trying to get on board, go and block the M25 if someone's trying to get a funeral. That is a great idea. And I am unpersuadable I hear arguments about the suffragettes and walking into things and blowing themselves up, and that got women the vote. You cannot persuade me in this very delicately poised, febrile culture war atmosphere that blocking motorways is a good idea. Having said that, it's left other groups with a bit of a problem about how they ought to engage on this stuff.
Yeah. And quite possibly a lot of what they do mightn't be seen. I remember Greenpeace published a league table of electronics companies, and Apple were near the bottom. Mm-hmm. And I think they just launched the iPod at the time. So, those funky silhouetted adverts. And suddenly the Greenpeace were saying, no, but this isn't cool. You're way below your peers. And I remember Steve Jobs doing a complete 180-degree turnaround. And from some of the work I've done recently, Apple seemed to be one of the best of those sort of mega consumer electronics companies in at least how they report what they do in terms of honesty and openness and transparency.
I think the best example of all of that is Nestle. Nestle was and then they're not a client, by the way, but they are. I was very involved with Nestle a long time ago when the Kit Kat palm oil viral ad came out with the bleeding orangutan fingers. And that precipitated, and that was Greenpeace, and it was a hugely effective campaign, and it precipitated a series of changes in Nestle, which began with palm oil, but then went into all of their top commodities. And Nestle was, back in the 15 years ago, Nestle was one of the most disliked companies in the world in terms of its corporate responsibility and sustainability, and now it is acknowledged by pretty much anyone as a leader. And so these transitions can happen, and that was because of a particularly effective Greenpeace campaign.
Yes, Nike was the other one, I suppose, although it was more social.
And Nike published the list of its supplier factories. That was quite a big moment after being, I think, in litigation for quite a long time, which they sort of went into the bunker, and then they published their suppliers. It was a big thing.
Yeah. And the other one, a few months ago, I had Ada Greenbury who was the sustainability manager at Asia Pulp and Paper when Greenpeace launched their campaign against them. And she was talking about how she had to suddenly create no deforestation policy, the first one in the world.
We worked on that with her.
Yes, which again is quite an extraordinary.
It was an extraordinary turnaround. I mean, it was an incredible turnaround. The APP turnaround with Greenpeace and the Forest Trust, as they were then called, back in 2012, 2013.
Yes,
and these changes are possible. The problem is sometimes companies do all this and then they regress. So, BP, there've been two big leaps forward by BP. Yeah. Both times they've gone back on it and retrenched. And this is a little troubling. But I mean, overall, the climate science is very clear. The biodiversity science is very clear. No company on earth can get away from these things. So you have these peaks and troughs of, we're going big on sustainability, we're cutting back. The overall direction is non-negotiable. And it's also non-negotiable in terms of government action, because governments know that citizens are not going to tolerate an ever worsening volatile climate. So they're going to have to deal with it.
Yeah.
And many of them are.
Although it's always linking the climate to the policies. Sometimes, the agriculture is an interesting one, because there are a lot of angry farmers about nitrogen runoff, which is in the Netherlands has gone down dark conspiracy theory lines, and yet they're also complaining they're not getting the same yield because of bad weather. And I don't know how we connect the dots. I don't know if you have any insight on that.
Yeah, it wasn't handled very well in the Netherlands. As it happens, my mother lives in the agricultural south of Holland, of Zeeland in the Netherlands, and so it is absolutely farming country. It's farming, sailing, and mussels, basically, a lot of dairy, and it just was not politically handled very well, and a lot of people who were quite on the liberal progressive spectrum in the Netherlands, went out demonstrating on behalf of the farmers because it was completely botched. It was so badly botched that Donald Trump was holding up the Dutch farmers as heroes. This is not really where you want to be, in my opinion, but that's how badly handled it was.
Yeah.
And there has to be a sense of pragmatism and fairness in the application of these policies, as we discussed before. Otherwise, people are going to get very, very angry very quickly, and it will switch off the entire agenda. And look at what's happened electorally in the Netherlands.
Yeah,
and this was part of that.
Yeah. And there seemed to be a similar thing happening to a certain extent with Welsh farmers last year. I don't know whether it's going to catch on the same way, but still, you were talking about the culture wars, pulling all that into that sort of culture war thing, and the, great replacement theory and these other conspiracy theories, which are easy to laugh off at one level, and then they always seem to go quite racist at some point. There always seems to be a racism element comes into them.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's a big Venn diagram of all the same issues. It's migration, it's gender issues, it's now astoundingly veganism. I mean, what a stupid thing to criticize.
Yes.
What does it matter if somebody's vegan? I mean, it's actually very good for their health and for the planet. But why would it bother you if someone was vegan? It's so peculiar.
Yes.
And now climate and what sort of car you drive. And I mean, there's a whole bucket of issues, and they're all in the same territory. And it's very, very worrying. And then all the stuff about statues and colonialism and being proud of history and not rewriting history and what people are taught in schools. And they're perfectly legitimate debates to be had. And I think actually some of it can go a bit far in the other direction. But we can't have this with the sustainability world. We can't afford that.
Yeah. I wonder sometimes, though, how effective that sort of element of society has been in trying to derail tackling climate change and net zero in the UK in particular, because, we've had all these different groups, the Global Warming Policy Forum and Net Zero Watch, and Richard Tice of Reform keeps standing up and shouting about net zero and whatnot. But one of the interesting things is that when Rishi Sunak, about this time last year, wasn't it, diluted the EV mandate and the heat pumps mandate, that's when his popularity started to drop. Now, obviously, there's a massive correlation causation, but going down that route didn't do him any good. I think we can.
To be fair to Rishi Sunak, no matter what route he went down. You're right. I think what happened with him was, and it was a pathetic spectacle to watch. Really, was that. And this is the problem in the Conservative Party, is that whoever leads it is a sort of hostage of the extreme right of the party.
Yeah.
That sort of ERG group.
Yeah.
They sort of captured Liz Truss and put her in there, and that was an absolute abject calamity. And then Sunak had to pander to them, and I mean, Johnson was a bit different in the respect that he'd won a big majority, so he didn't have to pander to them quite as much.
Yeah.
But they're like the sort of puppet masters. And so the Conservative Party really has become ungovernable. And, if you look at, if Kemi Badenoch is now the favourite, she is, she gave an interview the other day about how proud she was that her children were very right-wing and not vegan, and how much bacon they eat. I mean, this is not serious.
Yeah.
You can't run a G7 country like that. It's not possible.
Yeah. Although some people have suggested that she might swing to the centre, being because she was successful. Yeah.
But then people don't believe a word any politician says. So, and Keir Starmer's already been accused of this. So he's been accused of saying things to get the leadership and then reneging on them, or, that people think he's going to sort of do Remain by stealth, and he sort of said he would keep Brexit, but he isn't. And we've got, and I don't think there's any evidence for that, but we've got to live in we've got to be able to trust the people that govern us, otherwise everything breaks down. And then you see with the riots that we had here, and you see how febrile this is. I mean, that was on the basis of misinformation and conspiracy, that the person who had committed that awful attack, in Southport, was a migrant, and he was come over on a boat, and he had an Arabic name, which actually meant something like "I'm going to my apartment." I mean, it was completely, and it just spread, and we saw what happened. It doesn't take much.
No. But then the counter to that, of course, is, well, about a couple of weeks later, I went on. I'm not a big one for marching, but I thought I'd better show up to the counter protest, and there were at least 10 times as many of us as there were people angry.
It was a Saturday evening, wasn't it?
Yes. But we've sort of focused on a lot of, I suppose, barriers and problems. But what do you see as the big opportunities, particularly those we're not taking yet?
So green growth, clean technology, rewiring the economy, doing proper industrial strategy. We haven't not had an industrial strategy for years in this country. And I think Britain, under all sorts of governments, hasn't been very good at long-term industrial. So we get tangled up in endless rows about HS2, about nuclear, about airport expansion. You name the big infrastructure project, you will not find a simple one that was given the go-ahead and off we went. So I think that is a major opportunity, and there's the pylon infrastructure that needs to be built. That's obviously one. Improving public transport, absolutely critical. Clarity on everything from home insulation to heat pumps to onshore wind, and consistency, and then the right regulatory regime, the right fiscal regime for those things to work, doing the right, getting the trade-offs right. So I don't think that all EVs by a particular year is necessarily the right answer. There's all sorts of issues about tire emissions. There's issues about the LCA of batteries. Is it better to drive a knackered old Porsche into the ground than to go and buy a new Tesla? Probably yes. We've got to do the numbers on these things. Hybrids have a role, no question about it. So these kind of blanket. This is good, this is bad. It's like the palm oil thing. It's like deep sea metals. It's not as simple as that. So we have to have much more nuanced, pragmatic conversations about trade-offs, and they're difficult conversations.
Yeah. And again, that goes back to that public engagement issue, is that it's always easier to paint in primary colours, isn't it, as a politician? Whereas
Absolutely, and of course, and some of the NGOs are particularly good at painting in primary colours. Yeah, because that's what a good campaign looks like, to be honest, and it's very effective, but it doesn't always lead to the best outcomes.
Yes,
the unintended consequences are a real problem.
Yes, a bright orange, I suppose, is not quite a primary colour, but yes. So So I've taken up quite a bit of your time so far, but just to sort of sum up, you've spent a lot of time trying to make change happen. What would your advice be to, say, younger change makers moving into this space?
I think the whole sustainability industry has become. It's become this hugely sprawling, it's an enormous industry now, and I think the best advice I can give is develop something that you really know about. So don't just become a generalist box-ticking ESG person, because everybody's rebadging themselves as that. All the big accountancy firms, they're all doing, everyone's a sustainability expert, everyone's a net zero expert. The future is the big interventions on the big issues. How are we going to get the metals? What does landscape level conservation in tropical ecosystems look like? How do we transition the food industry to a more plant-based future? So, maybe pick an issue that you're passionate about, rather than going, well, I just fancy working in sustainability, so I'm just going to become an ESG generalist. I think the tide is probably moving away from that. Yes, there's assurance and compliance and all the countless disclosure and reporting requirements that companies now have to do, but actually the rich stuff is in the, how can I make a difference by being involved in a particular sector that's got a particular solution that's going to solve these problems for the next generation.
Fantastic, Brendan. I think there's plenty of great nuggets of wisdom all the way through our discussion this today. So just leaves me to thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.